U.S. students in most states and across almost all demographics have experienced setbacks in math and reading since the start of the pandemic. According to the National Assessment of Education Progress, also known as the nation's report card, only 36% of fourth graders and 26% of eighth graders are proficient or above in math. It's the steepest decline ever recorded. When it comes to reading, only 33% of fourth graders and 31% of eighth graders are proficient or above. According to the New York Times, Secretary of Education Miguel Cardona called the results, quote, appalling and unacceptable.
Journalist David Zweig tweeted, the NAEP scores and New York Times article are misleading a lot of people to conclude remote school didn't correlate with lower scores. Multiple analyses comparing districts show an overt correlation between time out of school and learning loss. Zweig joins us now to expand on this. Welcome.
Hi.
So walk me through the misrepresentation here. What does the Times article say, and why do you think that people are getting it wrong?
Yeah, so these national test scores came out, and the Times article, and quite frankly, most of the media coverage pointed at, oh, look at this. If you look at California or different places, that we're not seeing a big difference in the states that were known for having a higher rate of remote instruction versus in person, they weren't seeing a big difference. And a whole slew of people were tweeting this out. And I think Jennifer Rubin at Washington Post and others are saying, look, see? But the problem with that is that this is really kind of superficial. It's not even an analysis. That's even too, specific or generous of a word. It's really just a crude observation of state data. But there happen to have been a number of studies, at least 3 that I know of, that were carefully done analyses of data, but they looked at individual districts rather than at state level. And when you look at the individual districts within a state, or multiple states, it tells a very different story.
Right. I've seen data from Emily Oster. I think that's one of the studies you're referring to. Yeah, my understanding is when you look at that, you do see a clearer breakdown in the longer, the more the schools were open in a district, they don't have the same degree of learning loss. Is that accurate?
So there's a study, Emily Oster looked at a lot of these data. There was a study out of Harvard, and there's a study by Vladimir Kogan, who's a political scientist at Ohio State. And what they found in Kogan's research, where they looked at individual districts comparing in-person school percentage, and they found that students in districts who were fully remote were up to 3 times higher rates of I'm flipping around, but higher rates of these poor scores. There was up to 3 times greater loss in the test score averages. I mean, that is a massive difference, and it tells a very different story. So we're talking about 3 different analyses by 3 different researchers or research groups, and they all found the same. They all came to the same conclusion, which was that remote learning has a distinct and direct correlation with lower test scores. So to me, the bigger story here, kind of like top line, is this is a great example of, when you have kind of very basic data comes out and then the kind of confirmation bias of people, everyone immediately just kind of jumps to their conclusion without taking a step back and looking for what's actually going on within the weeds of the data. And everyone has confirmation bias, conservatives, liberals, everyone in between. But I think the relevant matter here is that most of the sort of prestigious media outlets all are very homogeneous as far as the political leanings. So when you have that, where the people with their kind of hand on the lever, and they all tend to swing in one way, and that confirmation bias swings in one way, you have something like this, which is a perfect case study. These test scores come out nationally. Everybody goes ballistic, telling the same story about how, look, it doesn't matter for remote learning. But when you actually look at the studies that were done, rather than just this kind of superficial analysis, you get a very different story.
Yeah, I saw that the Washington Post, I think Eugene Robinson is the column, wrote a column to exactly that effect, and then that was shared on social media by Randy Weingarten, the teachers union president, as if to suggest, yeah, this is bad, this is a crisis for all schools, but equally because they weren't denying that there was really that much of a difference between the various policies.
So I don't. Oh yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's just a great case study about how science and data are interpreted and represented oftentimes by the media. And again, I don't want to say that liberals or progressives are more prone to confirmation bias than conservatives may be. That's certainly not the case. It's just that they tend to be the ones who run most of the and work at the prestigious media outlets in our country. So you end up having a narrative that immediately, just fired out of the cannon, that everyone believes this thing. And unless the average person is not going to be aware of this. They're going to kind of superficially see a post on Facebook, or maybe they'll glance at the Times and see something. But unless you actually are looking at the data itself and looking at careful studies done by experts who are looking into this, you're going to be have a very confused understanding of what these data actually show.
So I don't think that anybody who has a child, knows a child, is a teacher, or knows a teacher can really credibly deny that remote learning obviously isn't as good as in-person learning, and can observe with their own eyes the consequences of remote learning on kids. I guess I'm curious, is there any part of this conversation that's geared toward actually figuring out how to get kids back on track?
That's a very good question. And, I would say one of the ways to think about it is that scores overall dropped. And when we want to think about, there obviously are a multitude of reasons of why that happened, because we want to understand why in order to understand how to fix it, right? And one of the things we have to think about is even the schools that were quote unquote open, the education in there was severely degraded and disrupted. Kids up until the spring of last year in most of the country were wearing masks. Their teachers were in masks. I mean, look, there's a reason why I'm not wearing a mask and you're not wearing a mask in this interview. We would have trouble hearing each other, trouble interpreting those things. Imagine you're a little kid in the classroom and for a full year, your teacher has his or her face masked and all of your peers have their face masks. There were quarantines happening all the time. So there is these severe disruptions to the learning experience even when they were in school. So I think one of the ways to think about resolving that is, because there are some people in public health right now who continue to say we should think about putting masks back on kids. The governor of New York mentioned parents, she recommended that parents have their children wear masks again because of RSV. So we need to, which is another virus that's very prevalent right now. So we need to think about how all these sort of anti-virus mitigations that we're putting in place, how these things impact the kind of day-to-day experience of children in a school building.
And if they're going to continue to be in a, go ahead.
If I could just get in, I'm sorry. I think it's really important to note that obviously we just came through a national tragedy, a global tragedy in this pandemic in which millions of people have died, and that the choice to shut down schools, the length of the shutdowns, I think is hotly in debate, and what we now know about transmissibility, et cetera, suggests that many schools should have been open a lot earlier. But we should also keep in mind that before the vaccines were disseminated, a lot of people were very concerned about the fact that not just that kids would get COVID, obviously they die at lower rates, but were in fact dying, but that they could come home and infect their parents who were dying at much higher rates, including people who are young. And obviously a lot of Americans do have these comorbidities that was making it a really risky proposition. So I'm really interested in this conversation about how to deal with the fact that unfortunately sacrifices were made because there really was early in the pandemic a need to address the fact that this scary thing was happening that we didn't know about. And now I hope the conversation can transition from the blame game, which is it's important to hold people accountable who knew information about what wasn't effective and kept schools closed despite knowing the better. But at some certain point, once people have been held accountable, we really need to be focused on how to get kids back on track. And that's going to take a policy intervention and not just the kind of kvetching that happens on the internet. But I really do appreciate you joining us today, David.
Agreed. Policy intervention is certainly, I think, going to be a necessary thing rather than just people complaining.
Yeah. Thank you. And we'll have more Rising right after this.